All right. Hello, and welcome back to Collectivitis, the podcast where we dissect the disease that is collectivism. I'm Pietro. This is Max. How you doing, Max?
I'm great, Pietro. How are you?
I'm good. We've listened to the feedback saying enough solo episodes, you two. We're sick of hearing from you. So we've got another fantastic guest on tonight. We've got our first lady joining us on Collectivitis, which is great because it simultaneously gives us a bit of female perspective and dispels the myth that all libertarians are just edgy young men. So we're very keen to let her in and have her tell her story. So her name is Kate Fantinel. She was the lead Senate candidate for Western Australia at the recent federal election. But her list of accolades is far longer than that. She's a former staffer for Senator David Leyonhjelm. She is a former staffer for Aaron Stonehouse MLC in WA, and she's a current staffer for David Limbrick MLC here in Victoria. So without further ado, I'll welcome her in. Lady Liberty, aka Kate Fantinel. How you doing?
Hi, thank you for having me on the show. And I have to say, I'm just as edgy as all you libertarian dudes. So pay me some respect, please.
I think our producers told us we've got a quota. They said we need a woman on the show. We're all about quotas here.
I'm much more than a quota, though, you know, right?
Yeah, well, just as edgy, but far less male, I'm guessing. So that's a good place to start. So my question, before we get into any of your story, the first very serious question. Kate, you were in the US recently, weren't you?
Yes, I went over to the United States of America. It was my fourth trip there. I thought after my federal Senate campaign, I deserved a break, but I ended up doing a bit of a libertarian speaking tour while I was over there. Had the best time. I love that country so much. So tried to bring back the value of liberty and freedom to Australia, but I'm still trying.
Were you surprised to find that they'd erected a statue of you in New York?
I was very flattered that there is a Lady Liberty in New York. I think they were more surprised that an Australian wannabe politician, I suppose, not that I actually want to be a politician, but she rocked up at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. in a taxi theft dress to troll the infamous AOC. So I think they were more surprised by me than I was by that statue.
Yeah, we'll have to get a picture of that somewhere on the graphic somewhere, because it's an absolute classic. The parody of the AOC with taxes theft is it's really, really great. So well, yeah, look, I were they surprised to find an Australian libertarian in the US? Like,
I think they were excited. So when I got to Washington, D.C., which was my first stop, I was invited to speak at a private function which had representatives from like the NRA, other lobby groups, Republican and Democrat senators there. And I just got up and told my experience in the federal election and what happened in Western Australia. And they were quite shocked to hear me say it was my first trip outside of Australia in almost 2 years, let alone my own state, because, of course, Western Australia, we closed our border, the iron ore curtain, as I refer to it as, and I was trapped in WA for the best part of 2 years. So very different experience to what you've had in Melbourne and Victoria, which if you want to talk about it tonight, I'm happy to.
Perfect. I think we'll touch on that later. With the trip to the US, is it safe to say that Australia's libertarian movement is probably the second biggest in the world after the US?
I think ACT in New Zealand would challenge you on that, because they've got more representation than us. But the party has definitely grown in my time. So I've been around a long time now, about 7 years. So I'm an old party hand. And I've seen the party change substantially, especially the last few years. And obviously COVID and the government overreach had a lot to do with that. And coming to Melbourne, Victoria, and seeing the change in demographics. So I'm not the only female at Lib Dem party events, which is just fantastic to see. And all the young women involved, like, it just warms my heart. And it's about time. It's about time that people valued liberty as much as people in America do. So it's unfortunate we had to go through a pandemic to get to this point, but I'm excited to be here in Melbourne, Victoria, on the ground with David Limbrick. There's nowhere else I'd rather be, and very exciting election ahead of us.
So, Kate, two questions regarding the persona that is Lady Liberty. First one is, how did it come about? We want to know the story behind that. And then the second one is, have you ever been recognised on the street? If someone ever came up and said, it's Lady Liberty, there she is.
So when I first announced my Senate candidacy on Liberty Chat, which I now host, straight after the show, I just had to update all my social media because it was a really quick announcement, like we were holding off. And then on Australia Day, they said, come on Liberty Chat and we'll announce you. And afterwards, I just thought, I need something more than just Kate Fantinel. I don't know. I just wanted to have something. And I just thought, Lady Liberty, that'll do. So I put that on my Twitter. And then it's kind of just evolved into this. Some people say monster, but I don't know what I'm trying to do with that character, because it is a bit of a character. I'm actually quite introverted and shy, and I like my own space and being at home with my cat and having a cheeky smoke on the balcony. So I just made this character, which I hope tries to sell libertarian to more people. Got the dress, the taxis theft dress, and yeah, I'm just trying to see what I can do for the movement with that character. And yes, I have been recognised. I was actually out in Perth with a good friend a few months ago, just before I moved to Melbourne, and some like young gentleman came up to me having dinner, and he was just like, oh my God, you're Lady Liberty. I'm like, hi. And he's like, oh my God, you're Lady Liberty. I'm like, did you vote for me? And he's like, of course I did. So that's the only time I've been recognised so far. But actually, since I've been in Melbourne, I've been surprised by the number of people who come up to me at events and say, oh, I loved everything you did in the campaign and you're Lady Liberty. So yeah, I guess I am recognised in our little niche circle, of course.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of going to say is, I mean, obviously in our circles, just about everyone I'd say would know you, if not for the Lady Liberty persona, but for being the WA lead Senate candidate. We all kind of knew who all the Senate candidates were. I think it's safe to say that your exposure to the public after having done this podcast will be exactly the same as what it was prior to doing this podcast. So don't worry about the fame and fortune that awaits you at the end of this. I think, except for our mums, which we always allude to as the only people who watch our podcast, they might recognize you.
You might even lose some audience after coming on this podcast.
Well, we got to get it to the normies, right? That's who we're trying to convert. Otherwise, it's just an echo chamber. We don't want that. We got to convert more people.
Well, that's exactly right, and that's kind of the mission statement of this. And our alternate mission statement from day one was that we'd say so many ridiculous things that we could never run for Parliament. So if you are serious about not being a politician, feel free to just let loose on anyone that you can think of tonight, and that will affirm forever your inability to run.
I definitely won't hold back. I haven't this far, and I won't start now. So somehow I'm still here. So it works sometimes.
Cool. Well, then tell us your story. How did it all start? How did you go from, I assume you weren't born a libertarian already knowing you were a libertarian. You were probably born a libertarian, but how did you fall into the movement? How did you, what's your story? What's the origin story of Lady Liberty?
Well, I'm from a small country town in South Australia, about 3 hours north of Adelaide. So spent the weekends on my grandmother's farm. Went to Adelaide and studied journalism when I turned 18, and then moved back to the country and worked as a journalist. And it wasn't what I thought it would be. It was very controlled even back then. So this is 15 odd years ago. And even back then it was just very biased, and I didn't get to write what I wanted in terms of honest reporting, which I think we're seeing today. So it only got worse. Moved back to Adelaide and did a graduate diploma in public relations. And then I got a job working for the mining and energy lobby in South Australia. So South Australia has very big uranium resources, and that's how I learned about mining, which is why I'm a passionate advocate for nuclear power, as is David Limbrick and libertarians and our party in general. And then the downturn of the mining industry, I got offered a job working for the Sporting Shooters Association of Australia, which is the Australian gun lobby. So it represents over 220,000 licensed firearm owners around Australia. I've always been around guns growing up in the country. So I've been hunting with my dad from a young age, and firearms are a natural part of my life. So I never really understood why they were feared, because I just grew up around it. It's part of my culture as well, half Italian. So my dad's got all his Berettas. He's very disappointed that my first gun wasn't a Beretta, but I think he's forgiven me now. And yeah, I was working in firearms, and that's when I met the infamous, iconic cult figure, former Senator David Linehelm in Canberra, lobbying for responsible firearm ownership and for us to be given a fair go, basically, because Australian gun laws, I feel, are the worst laws in the country, on the books. And me and him got along like a house on fire right from the start. I think he found me entertaining and cheeky, and intelligent is a word he used to describe me. So that was also good. And he offered me a job working in his office. And it wasn't until he was elected and I started following him that I realized I was a libertarian, because I've always been economically conservative but socially progressive. So I never quite fit in to the Liberal Party or the Labor Party, and I was never shooters and fishers or anything like that. And it was because of former Senator David Linehelm and his speeches and his whole time in Canberra that I realised I'm a libertarian. So a lot of people say that. He was the one who woke a lot of people up in Australia, and I'm eternally grateful, and he remains a really close friend of mine to this day.
What year was that you started working with David, or at least met him?
I met him back in 2016, and I started working for him in 2018.
Okay. So you're an identified libertarian, probably a bit longer than us. I think we're all born libertarians, but recently identified.
Yeah, and it's such a weird thing, because for me it was like the penny dropped. And no one else in Australia that I came across had really touched me how he was talking. I was just like, everything he said, I just couldn't, like, I can't believe there's a politician that 100% pretty much agreed with everything he said. And it's incredible to this day, but it's because of our principles. Like, it's not policies or policies on the run or the latest craze. And that's something in the pandemic that I found really inspiring, is even when it wasn't popular, we were saying there's too much government overreach, and it's disappointing, but it's a silver lining that we've had to go through the pandemic, and that's woken up a lot of people up in Australia to realise, hang on, we are really over-governed, over-regulated, and treated not like adults in Australia particularly.
Yeah, it's something I think is quite interesting. Whenever, like at the federal election, everyone was asking every party, okay, what are your policies going to be on this? What are your policies? And the same thing now, there's this sort of obsession between the semi-informed voting public. What are your policies? What are you going to do? And it's almost not all that important with the Libertarian Party exactly what the policies are. It's like, okay, well, if you know what libertarianism is, you can pretty much guess what all our policies are going to be at this election, at the next election, at whatever issue comes up throughout it. I think that's a real credit to the libertarian philosophy and to any party that adheres to that philosophy, is that it's reliable. You can guess exactly how they're going to vote every way. And I'm guessing that's something that David probably, that was attractive about David Linehelm.
Yeah, and it was funny working in Canberra. The major parties wouldn't come to us on certain things because they knew how we would vote, right? So like, they didn't even come knocking because they knew we would never vote for an increase in taxes or a reduction in liberty. That was the line, and he never crossed it. Aaron Stonehouse in WA never did. David and Tim here in Victoria never crossed it either. And every candidate who gets pre-selected has to make that pledge and promise. And that's why, like, it's great to be in a party where you don't have to worry about, am I going to have to sacrifice my own moral beliefs or ethics to support a policy that I don't agree with? Because we never get put in that position. I mean, there are some nuances and there's some issues that I know divide libertarians, and you can ask me my opinion on any of those, that's fine. But at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, which is to be left alone, our property respected, and live in a free society.
What a great reputation to have. Like, no one's going to come and try and bribe us for our vote because they know it's not up for sale. Like, what a better tagline than that to sell the party, if we were trying to sell the party or the philosophy.
Hashtag can't be bribed.
Yeah, that'd be a good campaign slogan. Can't be bribed. And I that bit about David sort of opening your eyes and the penny dropping is, I think it's something that resonates with me as well, because I was a libertarian probably not too long before I knew about the Liberal Democrats, but certainly before I knew about the Liberal Democrats, I didn't even know there was a Libertarian Party here until I started seeing David Leyonhjelm in the news for various bits and pieces, which is it's strange because, and prior to Leyonhjelm, we were very much a micro party. I'm pretty sure. Is that correct? Or I suppose that predates even you by a little bit.
Yeah. So John Humphrey's the founding father back in 2001 in Canberra, obviously founded a party, and Duncan Spender, who was the senior policy advisor for David Leyonhjelm that I worked with, was also one of the first founders. And yes, we've been around like 20 years now, 21 years, and it's taken a while to get electoral success. That's no lie, and there's different reasons for that. Obviously, the name is a big one that we have to grapple with every day. But yeah, the party has grown, and I'm proud to be a part of it, and I'm just doing whatever I can to further the cause, which is why I'm in Melbourne, Victoria, and I bought my taxis theft dress, and I'm still trying to do what I can to grow this party, because it's honestly the party of principle. We've got such a fantastic reputation and success when we are elected that I really feel like it is the answer to all of Australia's problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, look, that's why you're doing this podcast, and that's why we're doing this podcast, is not necessarily just for the party, but to try and spread the philosophy, because it really is the only thing that answers all the questions that not only for the things that have just happened, how could this have happened, but also the things that are imminently about to happen. I mean, libertarianism is the only thing that's correct on what to do about, the economy, not destroying the value of our currency, not proliferating wars in other countries that could potentially have disastrous consequences. Like, these are all the issues which right now everyone's kind of grasping for an answer. And it's like, hold on, non-interventionism and leaving everyone alone is actually the answer to these things. So, I mean, never more relevant than now, but also always relevant in a very different sense. Sorry, you go.
I think that's why I was particularly disappointed with the result of the federal election. I never thought I had a chance to win, but I just did what I could for the cause and stepped up to help rebuild the party in Western Australia. But to see the result that we got, like an increase in the Green vote, these teal so-called independents, Labor Party elected, to me, I was really devastated that night, because I felt like Australia was going in the wrong direction. And when I went to America and I was telling people we elected like a more left government than we've seen in a long time, they were just so saddened for us. But we're going to learn the hard way. And that's what I've been saying to when I was in America in particular. Australians are going to have to learn the hard way. We're sleepwalking into some version of socialism that I don't like, and we are giving our responsibility up to the government. And it's sad that our culture has turned into, as soon as there's a problem, we turn to the government for an answer instead of turning to ourselves. And that, to me, is a very dangerous path to go down. But what else can we do? We ran the biggest federal election campaign in our party's history. We had the Freedom Manifesto, which was 10 fantastic policies to save Australia. That's literally what we called it. And it just wasn't palatable to the Australian public. Well, not to enough of them. So federally disappointing, but got chance in Victoria, and that's why I'm here, and hopefully we can grow our representation.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So describe a little bit, because I mean, Victorian, and as any true Victorian, only really concerned with what's happening in my state. What was the crash that happened in the Liberal Party in WA previously? Like, what was the reason that you needed to rebuild the party there?
So it was really difficult because, and I've noticed since I've been here, the contrast in experience to what I went through in Western Australia compared to Melbourne. So whilst you were locked down in your own homes for extended periods of time, we were predominantly locked in our own state, but we maintained our lifestyle. So we had mini lockdowns whenever there was one community case. We would lock down for 3, 4, 7 days. But other than that, because the border was so tightly controlled and we're already an isolated state, and Perth is one of the most isolated capital cities in the world, we largely could lock ourselves in. And we have economic protectionism policies because we have the iron ore and the mining industries that kept us afloat. And now we've got a bonanza budget while Victoria is in massive debt. And it's quite fascinating to me, but I was really upset about how it was handled in Western Australia because I'm not from there. And to not be able to travel across the border in my own country for the better part of 2 years to see my family was absolute torture. I have 2 words tattooed on my collarbone, liberty and family. And they're the 2 things I value the most. So to have both of those things taken away from me, including coercion to get not 2 but 3 injections to keep your job, because McGowan mandated 3 injections, and we weren't allowed to leave or come back unless we were triple jabbed. It was just, and the sad thing is the state has so many other options it can go to before mandating something, and that's just where it seems everybody went. And I have this conversation with David Limbrick and others, like, who's the bigger dictator, McGowan or Dan Andrews? I don't actually know, because they controlled the populations to different extents. But McGowan, it's scary, still has that godlike Daddy McGowan personality. I'm wearing a Chairman McGowan do the right thing shirt at the moment because I think he's a bigger dictator than Dan Andrews. I know that's controversial saying to Victoria, but it was just evil what we went through in Australia, and that's why I ran for the Senate, because I just had enough.
Well, I actually don't think that that's that controversial a take. I mean, I remember, like, obviously there's heaps of hatred from our side for Andrews and everything he did, but even throughout all of it, there was kind of this acknowledgement that if, like, McGowan is just as bad, if not worse. Even when here we'd given up on lockdowns and, Omicron was rampant, not only in Victoria, but everywhere overseas. And you could see everywhere that, like, it was fine. Like, this was absolutely no reason to ever lock down or anything. McGowan's border stayed shut for months. So he outlasted Dan in his authoritarianism. Now, I don't know if that was because he was given a better opportunity due to the fact that he was so distant, but, like, there's definitely a comparison there to be made. I think it could be said that McGowan is just as bad as Dan. But I mean, at the end of the day, they're all the heads of state, and the state encroaches. That's what it does. That's its modus operandi. So makes perfect sense.
Although there's a comparison to be made, this probably isn't the nicest question, but what would you have preferred? Being stuck in WA for a few years or being somewhere like Melbourne?
Well, that's the thing I grapple with the most. So I went and saw Battleground Melbourne last night for the first time. I hadn't watched it because I wanted to watch it in Melbourne and in Victoria and in an audience. And to see what you guys went through, I didn't know the most, like half of it, because I was dealing with what was happening in Western Australia, going to all the protests there, talking to people who didn't want to get the injection and choosing their jobs between their own bodily autonomy. I definitely wouldn't have survived in Sydney. So I did move to Perth in February 2020, which was just before everything shut down. And I was living in King's Cross in a tiny little apartment. I would not have done very well in those circumstances. I know I said I'm an introvert, but I still need to be around people, right? And I still like going out in the gym and having a drink at the pub. So to take all those things away from a person, especially if you live by yourself, it would have been extremely hard. I don't think I would have got through it. So that's what I find the hardest about hearing what happened here, is because I distinctly remember being in a nightclub in Western Australia and it was packed, and you guys were in the midst of another chronic lockdown. And I remember just feeling so guilty and so confused about, did I want to keep the border shut to keep this lifestyle? But then we didn't even have to do that for so long. So to be trapped in a bubble and it was a mind fuck, if we're allowed to swear on this show. It was a mind fuck, and I still don't know what the answer is.
It's a really good way of pitting people against each other. It's like, I remember at the start of it when Australia had relatively low cases and all of Europe was kind of, burning from lockdowns and whatnot. And we were like, oh, keep the borders shut. That's great. We get to keep our way of life. And it's a really selfish way of looking at it. But that's the position that we were put in. It was like, okay, your liberties here are at ransom as long as you don't associate with these other people, which is like, it's absurd. I've got family in Italy, and even I had that same kind of thought fleeting for a moment, which is, it's something we have to contend with, and it's something that was imposed completely upon us by rules that, in the end, the way things turned out, never had any reason for actually being implemented, which is patently obvious now.
Well, my heart breaks for those who weren't there to see their loved ones die. I mean, I said the other day, if something happened to my dad, I would have crossed the border. I would have been arrested. I don't care. Like, you're not taking that away from me. Family comes first, and liberty. It's that delicate balance. But the way we locked Australians out of our own country and didn't let them back for so long and treated them like biohazards, and even in WA, we saw that kind of attitude. Like, if you want to leave, then don't come back, because why would you leave here and put everyone else at risk? That kind of like society that was created, it was really bad in Western Australia, because we were just so grateful to have our lifestyle, but we didn't have to sacrifice as much as we did. And one day I hope there's an apology and acknowledgement, but I don't know if we'll get it in my lifetime. I'll fight for it and I'll call it out, but who knows? No one wants to take accountability.
I don't think there will be. It's easier just to keep pushing a narrative and then just convince people that, speak up against it, that they're even further wrong than it is to admit you're wrong yourself, isn't it?
Yeah, well, they're going to have to pay one day. I mean, I've had people during my Senate campaign. I remember one lady came up to me and said that she escaped a domestic violence relationship during the pandemic and went to a women's shelter, but they wouldn't let her in because she wasn't vaccinated. So she had to return to that situation, and she called the police and they just said, too bad, get vaccinated. That's the kind of stories that I heard during my campaign, which stay with me to this day. And it's not forgivable. And I hope one day we have some kind of royal commission or something to hold these people to account.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm driven entirely by anger and a desire for vindication. I'm not afraid to admit that. Like, it absolutely fuels me. So I'm way on board with you there. And from what I remember hearing, now obviously you weren't working in David Limbrick's office at the time, but his office was apparently inundated with similar stories of just people in tragic situations where essentially it was their lives or their safety or whatever at risk, and I won't say final solution because of the connotations with that term, but the final outcome was you have to do this thing or you have to comply, but that's not coercion, right? No one was ever coerced, because you always had a choice at the end of the day, and really that's no choice at all in just about all of those situations.
That's the other contrast, because I was working in Aaron Stonehouse's office, who was a member of the WA Upper House until May 2021. So for basically a year, just over a year during the pandemic. But we didn't have those kind of calls because we kept our lifestyle. So people, like, we had the snap lockdowns and things, and it wasn't until the mandates weren't there yet. Like, the only thing mandated when I worked for him was healthcare. And we spoke up at the time and said, it shouldn't be mandated. At least give them a choice of vaccine. But apart from that, we didn't have the situation that you had because our border was shut. So it's such a contrast to what happened in Victoria. But then again, I think that's why we lost the seat in Western Australia, because people, they weren't angry about McGowan because they genuinely felt like they saved their lives and that they protected WA, which I suppose is a big part of his job. But we were still part of Australia. I call it secession by stealth. There's always this talk about WA seceding. he basically seceded by stealth for the better part of 2 years. And we didn't get a vote on that. And we had, like you, chief health officers and unelected bureaucrats making decisions. We never saw the advice. So we were at the whim of the state government, but because we didn't have cases, we could have our lifestyle. I don't know. It's still something I struggle with to this day.
When was the Western Australian election?
March 2021.
Do you think perhaps if it was, let's say it was now, the same as Victorian state election, do you think that Labor and McGowan would have won so comprehensively still? Do you think they sort of had that benefit of the time of the election that, that was like 12 months into the pandemic, people were still feeling a little bit safe? They weren't over it yet. Do you think if it was now, they would have been like, no way, get rid of McGowan?
There's definitely more people who are awake and angry now. So my Senate result was about 2%, which I know isn't that much, but it was about 40,000 people voted for me, right? So, and that wasn't from confusion or anything. I think it was genuinely because of the campaign that I ran, and a lot of that was because of the gun stuff that I did, which we can talk about in a little bit. But the other problem is the Liberal Party are so weak in Western Australia. That's why they got wiped out as well, because they weren't offering sensible alternative or any solution really. So people just thought, oh, well, we'll just give it to McGowan. And now he's got control of the upper and lower house, absolute power, one-party state. He's put through this horrifying pandemic legislation, which I've spoken about on other more WA-based podcasts, just as bad as what you guys have here, if not worse. So, come into your house without a warrant, seizing property, forcing you into quarantine. There's even stuff about forced medical procedures. That's gone through WA Parliament in the space of a week because he's got absolute power. So hopefully by the time the next election, which is March 2025, people will understand that, okay, if you do want to have Labor in government in the lower house, fine, but pay attention to who you have in the upper house. We needed a David Limbrick and a Tim Quilty in WA. We didn't get one. We lost our only representation for a number of reasons. And this is what you get. You have no strong voice of opposition at all in Western Australia, and it's terrifying. I don't want to go back. Please don't send me back. Please keep me in Melbourne.
Well, hopefully McGowan will lock the border again, and then you can't go back. So no one can send you there. No, I'm kidding. Hopefully he doesn't lock the border.
Never lock down again.
From what I understand, McGowan is remarkably popular in WA. Like even now, he's, if anything, all of the lockdowns and the rest of it, mandate stuff, has increased his popularity.
Well, he wasn't, I think he was polling at something like 92% or something crazy at some stage. I mean, that's unheard of because we kept our lifestyle for so long. Yeah. But for the 10% of the population who aren't from there, including from overseas and interstate, it was difficult. Like I couldn't see my family for 2 years. To me, that's a huge thing. To others, people don't care about their families. It's all about values, right? I don't know what his popularity rating is now. All I care about is what it is in March 2025. And I hope there is some kind of uprising so that he doesn't have absolute power. I think that would be a great first step.
Uprising might be a good term to throw into the topic of guns. Hopefully it doesn't get to that point, but...
Well, I was actually kind of wondering a thing about to sort of lead between pandemic and guns is something that... So do you think... So the US obviously has this much broader gun rights culture, largely because of the Second Amendment, which in effect says that your guns you're supposed to have the ability to defend yourself against the government becoming tyrannical is kind of where their Second Amendment comes from, which implies that you have the same access to weaponry and technology that the government would have in case they ever became tyrannical. Now, obviously, we're way beyond that point, and that's kind of something that people point out as a hypocrisy of the Second Amendment is, well, you don't have nuclear weapons or anything, so you can't actually defend yourself against the government. But something that we saw during the pandemic was that in the US, even in the states that were the most Democrat-led and left-leaning and authoritarian in their responses to COVID, never saw the same level of they never saw the same amount of lockdowns, and they never saw the violence on the street of police shooting rubber bullets at civilians and all that sort of really, really dystopian imagery that we see in Topher's Battleground Melbourne film. Do you think there is some correlation there between a more widespread access to guns for citizens and that difference in response?
100%. And that country was founded on freedom and libertarianism. The founding fathers, we still quote them in our circles to this day, classical liberalism. So they didn't want a situation where the people were controlled by governments. That was the basis of the whole constitution. So they wrote a document to ensure that that would never happen. And when I was in America, I had this conversation with Americans, like, I would love to live in your country. I love your country. And they said, why? I said, because you're free, like you're freer than Australia. We don't value freedom. We were locked in our homes or in our states. And one lady said to me, they told us to stay home, but we didn't. We just did what we wanted because we value our individual liberty. And we also have guns. So that also came up a lot. I see guns as the ultimate symbol of freedom, right? Because they're the equalizer, especially as a woman. I don't have the same power as a man. That's just a reality. I don't care if I'm going to get cancelled for saying that. So for me, it's the ultimate protector. It's the equalizer. So I want a Second Amendment in Australia. That's what I believe in. I believe we should have the right to defend ourselves and to never be in a situation where we're locked in our homes again because we had nothing. We marched in the streets and they shot bullets at us, or they sent us home, or they put us on a list to watch us in the future because we're the recalcitrant. So I really want to change Australia's attitude towards firearms. And I think the one way that I've tried to do it is calling it out when these governments try and paint us as criminals, which is what the police minister in Western Australia did to us. So a little bit of background for those who don't know, the police minister, Paul Papalia, gave a list of addresses of all law-abiding licensed firearm owners, of which there are about 92,000, to the mainstream media in Western Australia, who published a map on the front page of the West Australian newspaper pinpointing where these people lived. And you could actually reverse engineer it to zoom in on a street and show the exact location of a home where guns were stored. These were registered guns by law-abiding people who had gone through the process to get a firearms license and maintain it, not criminals. And he doxed the entire WA licensed firearm owners population. You guys can't even believe it.
I didn't know that. I remember hearing something about the revealing a register of who had guns and whatnot. But that's
their home addresses.
If there wasn't a backlash uprising then I think we've reached communism. I think we've reached, if not communism, totalitarianism. That's absolutely fucked.
To be fair, if anyone was to access that map and say, okay, I'm going to go to this house and get their guns off them, it'd be a pretty bold move.
It's happened.
Really?
So there's been violent home invasions where guns have been stolen, and there's been a few incidents now. And we believe, I talked to the shooting groups over there, we genuinely believe it's because of that map. So incidences of break-ins have increased since this map was published. People didn't feel safe in their own homes because of what he did. So the government's talked about keeping people safe and community safety and public health during the pandemic. He literally put community safety, public health at risk by releasing this document. He didn't leak it. He literally handed it over to the press and asked them to publish it because that's how corrupt the press is in Western Australia. So that's a bit of context. That's why I came out during my federal election campaign. Some people thought it was very off script, but for Western Australia, there's no Shooters and Fishers Farmers Party now. There's no representation for guns at all. With my background, 5 years working for the gun lobby, I'm a shooter, I'm a pistol shooter, I'm a hunter as well. I felt like I had a responsibility, and because it is a libertarian issue, whether you want to talk about it or not because of the Overton window is another discussion. Everything I did was libertarian, principled, researched, and I thought on point. So I put myself on core flutes with a 303 and with my little 22. I went to the police minister's office. I stood out the front and I said, give gun owners a fair go. I went in to give it to him and said, here, I just want to remind you that there are 92,000 of us that you've treated like this. So here is my core flute to put on your wall. I thought they were going to call the cops on me because they thought it was a threat. But I thought, no, you can't treat law-abiding people like that. So that's where my Senate campaign came from. And hopefully it made a little bit of a difference, but there's no privacy laws in Western Australia either, right? So they're the only state that has no privacy legislation. So it's been found that he actually hasn't broken any laws. That's how perfect it was. He hasn't broken any laws. He can't be held responsible. We feel unsafe in our own homes in WA. We've had break-ins because of it. We're a disarmed population, really. What do we do?
Well, I noticed during the back end of last year, back end of 2021 in Victoria, on TV, there was a huge campaign and push put out for gun owners to hand them in again. It was like John Howard all over again. And it leaves a bit of a dirty taste in your mouth when you consider the pandemic legislation is being pushed through in multiple states, especially the one in WA right now, where, allowed to just enter homes. If you render the population defenseless, who holds the government to account when it gets to a tipping point? And I think there's definitely a motive behind it.
Well, libertarians, and I think what you said before is not only correct, and it really brave what you did, but you're exactly right, and that's the whole reason why we are libertarians, right? It's okay, the Overton window doesn't allow this, but this is wrong, and it doesn't matter if we're not allowed to say it, and if people might shun us or whatever. This is just like wrong on the most base, like obvious level to anyone who pays attention, and that's that story. I didn't know quite how bad that was, so that's really, really shocking. But well done. I'm actually a little surprised you didn't get a bit more recognition in the polls for having stood up for a group that is so marginalized there. I would have thought maybe there was a bit more of them.
Well, I think it was hard because I basically ran like a 3-week Senate campaign on not very much money. And the party after the state election is still rebuilding there. So I did manage to run 10 lower house candidates, myself and Dr. Peter McLaughlin as my number 2. So we did end up having quite a strong team in Western Australia, but we're still rebuilding the party there. It's in great hands now. I don't know where I'm going to end up or if I'll run again or if I'll be there in 2025. As long as someone who's in that position can really stand up for those kind of key issues, especially after what the police minister did. That's why I have these memes about him. I need to do another meme trolling him again. He blocked me, of course. I did offer to debate it. I did say I'm happy to debate you on firearms, but he never called me back.
When you consider that, like, you got 2% vote at the federal election, when you consider that's 1 in 50 people, and it's not just people throwing their vote away randomly, and you've got them, that's 1 in 50 people genuinely engaged and well-informed voting for you. I think that's a pretty good result, considering that a big chunk of the votes to the major parties are people who have no idea about politics. That's all they know. So I think 1 in 50 actual informed voters is a great achievement.
Thank you. And I think WA is particularly hard because they don't value liberty, especially, well, you've seen the popularity of McGowan. It's just trying to educate people that want to hand over liberty. Well, what have you got to live for? Like, why would you want the government making all these decisions? So it's a bit tougher in Western Australia. I've got more hope in Victoria, I must say. It's people seem a little bit more awake here. Like in WA, you can't speak too loudly against McGowan in a pub or you'll get evil glances and glares and you'll end up in an argument. And I've had that happen a few times, especially some young man's trying to talk to me and he brings up McGowan. It doesn't usually end well if he's a McGowan fan. But yeah, Melbourne, Victoria seems to be a bit more aware of Dan Andrews, and Battleground Melbourne just for me really opened my eyes of how bad he is
Is it a good tactic to repel someone if they're hitting on you and you're not interested? Just say "fuck McGowan" and they go reeling off into the distance. No, my McGowan, don't.
I think it's a good. I think it's a good. You know, as conversation started to see if there's any point talking to them.
Yeah, that's true. Like a litmus test. Like, so
Yeah.
fuck McGowan. Now what?
Yeah. And if they say, "But he saved our lives and kept us safe." Yeah, have a great night. Have a great life.
One thing I was wanting to get your thoughts on. So it's there are certain groups and certain parties here that are pretty pro-gun, like the shooters, fishers, and farmers and whatnot. Like, and I think that they have a seat in the upper house here in Victoria. So there's certainly some following for them, at least for that. But it's quite different to the intention of guns as per libertarian ideals, which is, the shooters, fishers, and farmers. It's like, okay, guns are good for recreational use and it's a hobby and we have every right, and for hunting and whatnot, and for, defending your home against invaders or pests or whatever. But the libertarian position is very different. It's almost like okay, yeah, hunting and all that stuff is good, but it's irrelevant compared to the real reason for guns, which is for to defend yourself against a tyrannical government, and the idea that perhaps there shouldn't be such a stringent need on registration and having the government know exactly where they all are, because the second the government decides to become as totalitarian and authoritarian as it did in WA, they know where all the guns are, and that's the first people whose houses they come to knock on. So how do you approach that conversation with Australians for who that's really a foreign concept? That's kind of the point that is quite difficult for me, because some Australians are open to guns for hunting and this and that and whatever. How do you broach that conversation just with the general public?
Well, I think the anti-gun lobby has been very successful in arguing guns purely from an emotional perspective, right? They go straight for the emotion. They talk about Port Arthur. They talk about, not everyone should have a firearm. I don't think everyone should have a firearm either, by the way. I think if you have a history of like criminal behavior and you can't be, proven to be a fit and proper person, 100% you shouldn't have a firearm. I'm not advocating for everyone to have a firearm. I'm advocating for responsible individuals to have firearms and have access to them. And honestly, registration to me is a joke, because if you're a licensed firearm owner, or if you're not on some system saying you can't have a firearm, then it doesn't matter if you have 1 to 10 guns. It doesn't even matter what type of gun you have. And one of the gun laws in Australia, which is absolutely shocking, is that a gun can be banned because of what it looks like, not because of its functionality. So it's appearance laws. And I know Tim Quilty has spoken about this in Victoria, and Senator Linehelm did as well. And I wrote a speech for Aaron Stonehouse about it, because why should something be banned purely because it looks too scary? And that's the laws that they have in Australia. Australian government at a federal level can ban a gun from being imported, and at a state level it can be classified to the point where you can't own it just because of what it looks like, not because of its functionality. I mean, that conversation, I think most Australians would be able to understand and go, actually, yeah, it doesn't matter what it looks like, it's what the functionality is. So that's a great start. The other thing that I try and do is I talk about it from an emotional perspective too. So my father grew up hunting with him, and when I go home to South Australia, that's what we do as daughter-father bonding. To me, that's really special. I'm a pistol shooter. I've won 2 championships because of my pistol shooting against men. To me, that's really empowering. I've been on the cover of a magazine for my pistol shooting. I mean, that's really empowering too. And the other thing that I would say, which is quite personal, is I've been in a situation where a firearm could have really changed the whole situation for me. So being in a domestic violence situation, and because you can't use a gun as self-defense, the equalizer, to me, that really changes my perspective too. So I'm going to go back at these anti-gun people, and I'm going to talk about emotion now, because I tried talking about it from facts for 5 years. All I did was stem the tide as a gun lobbyist, like held the tide back from like lever actions got recategorized during my 5 years at the gun lobby, but there were so many other things that we stopped. They're talking about registering every single piece of ammunition. They want registration on ammunition. Like, this is the crazy stuff that they're pushing. So there's a lot of stuff that hasn't got through because of my work in the gun lobby. But now I'm talking about emotion, because that's what the anti-gun lobby does. So that's how we're going to have to fight it.
And you're exactly right. It is emotion, and that's exactly why a gun that looks far more deadly than it is, or has a functionality that's not what it looks like it has, is banned, because it's all from an emotive point of view. That's what most of the governments or the state rather, their encroachments come from. They come from your safety is at risk, therefore we'll take something from you to give you this false sense of security. I'm pretty sure aren't gel blasters banned in is it Queensland or is it everywhere? Because
and
they look
WA
like
and South
and
Australia,
WA.
yes.
They might be banned here. Now, I don't pretend to know anything about guns, but like that isn't that case in point. Like the most, it's not a gun, but because it looks like a gun, it's banned.
Well, even paintball guns, they're not guns either. Air rifles, I wouldn't categorize them as firearms, but that's the world that we live in Australia. So we've got a big fight ahead of us trying to get our guns back. And maybe that's where I'll end up after the election. I don't know. I'll always speak out for what I believe is true, and guns are a big passion for me.
We'll never forget when Apple and Android removed the gun emoji. Thank God they saved us.
They did what? Sorry, I don't know. I don't know about this. Tell me about this.
A few years ago, they removed the gun emoji and replaced it with the little like laser zappy gun.
I think it's a water pistol.
Or a water pistol, yeah, because you don't want to influence people to think guns are.
It was
cool
too threatening.
Yeah.
It was too threatening to have a real firearm as an emoji. That's the world that we live in.
I feel so safe now.
Well, who's to say how many lives that saved? I didn't realize how safe we all were. Wow, that's really comical. All right, so I'm an inner city Melbourne lefty socialist communist hipster. What and the topic of guns has come up. How do you start that conversation, or even how do you approach that in any way? Because I've been in these conversations, and for me, as someone who doesn't know the arguments as well, it's a losing battle from the first second. How would you approach that?
Well, the first thing I say, have you ever actually held a gun or shot a gun or seen a gun? And most of the time it's no. So I don't know about you, but a lot of people have been to Vegas and they've shot 50 cows and fun things. And so that's what I bring up. I said, but if you were in Vegas, would you go and try shooting? And they'd say, yeah. And I say, well, what's the difference trying it in America? Why can't we have that kind of society here where it is tourism based? Like, that's the first start, really. So if you don't want every individual to have one, what about for tourism? And would you go and do it? And they're like, actually, yeah. So that's a good first start. Then it gets a little bit harder when you try and talk about personal responsibility, because most people don't want to accept personal responsibility.
Well, that's the role of the government, right? Is to remove the need for personal responsibility. It's a lazy thing for most people.
And then the other question I ask is, have you read a history book where disarmed populations are, massacred by their governments? And that's probably when the conversation ends. But, well, that's on them. Like, I'm not making that up. That's history. So some people, you can lead a horse to water, but...
I said I was an inner city lefty communist type. Of course, I haven't read a history book. That was already patently obvious.
I'll never support disarming the population, but I would be a lot more open to it if the police were disarmed. You can't take guns away from society and then leave government powers with them.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the British policing model. So they're more about community policing, and they don't actually have firearms on them. So they're there to actually be a part of the community and to help someone with directions and that kind of thing. So the police history and culture in Australia, especially Victoria, is petrifying. WA, it hasn't been that bad during my time there, but who knows, really? Who knows anymore?
Well, I mean, that solves a lot of the ethical problem around, widespread gun existence or proliferation is, if the state didn't have a monopoly on violence, a lot of our need to be armed goes away. If everyone had swords and bows and arrows again, and guns didn't exist, then all we would need are swords, bows and arrows. That doesn't answer the great equalizer question to some extent. But I mean, I'd certainly, as you said, Max, I'd sleep a lot easier at night if the people who have me currently subjugated didn't also have the monopoly on violence that they do. Cool. Well, all right. Is there anything else that you kind of wanted to talk about leading into the state election, Kate? What are your hopes? What are your ideas? What is your prediction for the state election?
Well, firstly, it's an absolute honor to be here. So I came back from America and I was sitting in Perth wondering, what am I going to do with my life now? Because I quit my job to run for the Senate and come back to the party. And I didn't think I would win, but I knew it was the right thing to do. But that still doesn't help you pay the rent or pay off your American trip. So to get the call up from David Limerick to come and work for him is like one of the biggest thrills in my life, which might sound a bit sad, but he's honestly such a hero of mine. And I remember watching him during the pandemic and how emotional he got when that pandemic legislation passed. Just broke my heart. But then seeing in contrast when he was at the protest and people were going up and giving him a hug and shaking his hand, him and Tim Quilty as well, they've just been such powerful voices for the party. And to be here and working for them, it's just such an honor. And we need to get them re-elected, right? Like, can you imagine what Victoria would have been like without these two incredible individuals in your parliament in the last 4 years? I mean, I've been through it in WA. It's terrifying to not have a libertarian voice, and for you guys to have two such strong, principled people representing you. I had to come over and help and do anything that I can to get them re-elected and maybe even expand our representation. Wouldn't that be something?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. And I suppose you had front row seats at seeing what the comparison was between having, a libertarian representation and then losing that libertarian representation right before one of the most critical moments. I imagine that was extremely disappointing to right as mandates and stuff were coming in 2021, having to look to Victoria for hope because there wasn't a libertarian there. So yeah, I mean, there's always a need for a libertarian voice, and who's to know when the next moment of the next moment where it all comes to where the shit all hits the fan. I was trying not to swear, but why bother not swearing when the next moment that the shit hits the fan is, and it could be around the corner, and there probably are a few very, very imminently close. Well, we appreciate all you do, Kate. Thank you so much for coming to our state. We do hope you stick around.
Well, if people want me to, I will. I love Melbourne. Obviously from South Australia, I used to come to Melbourne a lot for wild weekends when I was younger. So to be back here, I've had some wild weekends, but they've all been like work-related wild weekends, because libertarians, we work really hard, but we also love to party hard. So I've had a great time since I've been here. I'd love to stick around. We'll see what the election holds. There's no promises for me in terms of jobs, which is politics. I mean, I've moved to Sydney, to Perth, and now Melbourne for this party and for this cause. So I'm no stranger to the gypsy life. But yeah, just happy to be here. Happy to be on your show. Thank you for having me. Thank you for all the work you two do. You've been very impressive young gentlemen. So keep up the good work.
Thank you very much. I will say that I haven't done this before, but anyone who is watching us, so our mums and hopefully now your mum as well, Kate, should follow us on Instagram and follow us on Spotify. I'm just now learning how to properly be a podcaster. Is there anything else I've missed, Max?
You should know that today on our Instagram, the link to our Spotify and our YouTube and our Audible pages was taken down. I did joke in our last episode about censorship and how long it would be until we get censored. It possibly happened. It could possibly just be a technical glitch. We'll go with censorship because it's a good story.
They heard we had Lady Liberty coming on and they thought, no, shut that shit down. We can't have her voice out there. She's a pro-gun nut.
I think Mark Zuckerberg's at my door right now.
Is that the
That's why you need a gun, Max.
I know. I need to get one. I need to get one. Maybe you can help me get one, Kate.
Thank you so much for listening. Thanks again for coming along, Kate. We'll see you all next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.